done in the presence of the most educated people in Europe at the time, try to explain what was going on. Like I said, I'm not going to. It went on. The king was very, very concerned. I mean, keep in mind, this king had a hard time making firm decisions. So the king began to farm her out first from one cleric to another. They tried to determine, first of all, if she were a virgin or not, because they accused her of being a witch. And of course, they figured that no witch could be a virgin. Well, they determined finally that Joan of Arc was in fact a virgin. And this, of course, made things really difficult for the king because, all right, outside his palace, an army was collecting. People were coming in, volunteers were pouring in from all over France. And he knew, the people who were coming in knew, that Joanne was the reason. So what was her only qualification to lead an army was she was the main reason this army collected. I mean, people were beginning to feel a little patriotism. It was catching on fire. This was the one thing, by the way, that France needed. They outnumbered the English 4-1 anyway. All they needed was someone to show a little bit of incentive, a little bit of initiative, and they could turn the tide of the war. Well, this army that the king all of a sudden had, did he want to give it to this peasant girl or not? And again, he ultimately, though the bishops and clerics, the priests all told him, sir, you're the king, you've got to make the decision. He tried to farm her out to someone else, and ultimately she came back to him. Now, if you read in detailed account of the questions they asked her and the answers she gave would show that she was really a very highly intelligent, gifted woman. Take that for what you will. I mean, when she was given questions, she answered with such wisdom it astounded the persons who were questioning her. But finally, the king realized he had to make a decision. One of his cities, Orleans, was being besieged, and the people of Orleans were begging for help. The king until now had not had an army. The king finally did the unthinkable. He gave the command of this army to Joanne and sent her and his army on their way to Orleans. So off they went. Now, the last time I researched this, I read that Joanne, we do not know how many orders she actually gave to the men. We do know that she was involved every time that the top brass, the top generals of the army met, and generals and colonels and whatever. Every time the top brass met, she was sitting in on the meetings. How much she actually advised, how much she actually ordered, we don't know. We do know this about her, though. She was extremely domineering. She had another problem. She had two problems. One, she was domineering. Number two, she always dressed in boys' clothes. She said that God had told her to dress that way. Again, each of you can be suffered, but she was basically a transvestite and a cross-dresser. And this bothered the people of her day who felt like a woman should not dress in men's clothing. Nevertheless, she did. She went to Orleans, engaged the English. First day of battle, she was hit by an arrow. Again, the English were excellent arrow people. Weak and stabbed with pain, they carried her off the battlefield. But once off the battlefield, she learned that her side was losing. So she forgot about her pain, got back on her horse, and went and rallied the troops, told the ones who were running, oh, hey, turn back, turn back. And these men, all of them who were retreating, turned around. She turned the tide of battle, won the Battle of Orleans, sent the English running, and lifted the siege of Orleans. Victory number one for Joanne, victory number one for the King of France, Charles VII. The next battle she engaged in, the English captain was so terrified, or the English general was so terrified, that he refused to fight, and he had his men retreat right away without an engagement. They, you might say, court-martialed, and in fact, court-martialed that general and sent him home in permanent disgrace for not even having the courage to fight. Battle number two went to Joanne. Now, to make a long story short, Joan of Arc was to win 4 battles. And this gave all of the French people a lot more confidence. The king himself, who had been somewhat in hiding, was now able to walk around the palace with his head high and with a lot more confidence. You might say strutting around. More confidence he had before. I mean, any king who's won his last 4 battles is going to get more respect. Yeah, he got more respect, all right. He finally decided he could have himself crowned. So he got together his men and went to Reims, as the kings had been doing for 100 years, more than 100 years. And he had himself crowned King of France at Reims. And there's been a magnificent painting done of the crowning. The king, of course, knelt down in front of the priest, received the crown. His wife knelt beside him. His wife was on the king's right. On the king's left was Joanne, dressed in the pale armor. Some people said the armor was white, but she insisted the armor was silver. But she was dressed in man's armor with a sword. And she was there at the coronation. So she felt a lot of pride in her accomplishments. And then she said that this pride was her undoing. Her next move was to insist that they go to Paris. The king and all of his generals said, no, wait now. Now we've won 4 battles. We're not ready to take on Paris yet. You may know Paris was the capital. We can't get Paris yet. It's too strong. Joanne insisted, no, we're going to Paris. Joanne, being the type of woman she was, highly domineering and strong-willed, got away. This was a mistake. She should have listened to the king and listened to the generals. On her way to Paris, the Burgundians, who were French, the Burgundians captured her and turned her over to the English. The King of France had no interest in rescuing her. The King of France had no interest in working up a deal to save her, partly because as long as she was around, he was nothing more than a lackey himself. She was so domineering, she even told him what to do. We don't know for sure, but a lot of persons believe that her domineering had a lot to do with why the king did not care to save her. Anyway, she spent a year on trial, during which time she was questioned, and at first she answered with a lot of wisdom, but finally she was tried for witchcraft. They finally told her, you're going to burn in hell forever because of your practicing of witchcraft, of necromancy. You're lost. At that point, she broke down. She said that her voices were fake, that she never really had heard them. But then she got off to herself and thought, no, I really did hear them. So she recanted her confession. Make a long story short, then, the British convicted her of witchcraft, burned her at the stake. But no sooner had they done it than a bunch of them said, may God help us, we have burned a saint. Well, the King of France, to make up for his lack of care, gave her family the title of nobility and exempted her family from taxes for 300 years. In those days, nobles didn't pay taxes. King of France did that much for her family. However, her father did not enjoy his title of nobility. He died 2 years later, mostly of a broken heart, mourning for his daughter Joanne, who was the 3rd family in the family of his 5 children. The mother lived to be an old woman. After 20 years had gone by, the mother, who is now still a noblewoman, petitioned the king, who was still alive. King Charles also lived to be an old man. They petitioned him to, hey, write a letter to the Pope and ask the Pope to retry Joanne's case, because the Pope had the power, of course, to overturn anything that the other clerics had laid down. Well, by the time the letter got the Pope, most of the clerics who had convicted Joanne were dead, but a few were still alive. What that Pope did was he overturned all the charges brought against Joanne that were levied by the clerics who were now deceased. Well, if you know anything about popes are usually up in years, and they don't live long, especially at that time. The average pope in those days lasted about 5 years. Short time later, that pope died. A new pope took over. By this time, all the clerics who had convicted Joanne were dead. So the new pope received a letter from the King of France requesting that the new pope look into the case and retry it. The pope did, and he exonerated Joanne of all charges. So Joanne's mother lived to see Joanne fully restored to the church, with full assurances that she was in heaven, and that she was fully restored. In other words, She was declared innocent of all charges that were levied against her, and all the charges were overturned. So that supposedly brought some closure to her mother. In the meantime, well, jumping ahead of the story a little bit, Joanne's memory was never forgotten. World War I broke out. When World War I ended, Europe was greatly divided, and the Pope felt like we need to get someone, put someone forward who could help unite Europe. So the Pope made Joanne a saint in 1920. 2 years after World War I ended, Joanne was elevated to the status of sainthood. Her day is May 30th. Most of you probably are too young to know, but May 30th used to be Memorial Day until Richard Nixon changed it to the fourth Monday, to the last Monday every month. Pardon me. He changed the last Monday in May, yes.
For birthdays.
What's that?
Birthday.
Yeah, a girl I once dated had a birthday on May 30th also. And she was old enough to know that when she was a child, her birthday occurred. May 30th used to be Memorial Day. Like I say, Richard Nixon changed it. It's still sometimes, Memorial Day sometimes falls on May 30th, but now it's always on Monday. The whole reason for that is economics. Like they changed Thanksgiving to always fall on Thursday so that we'd have a Friday to begin the Christmas season on Friday when people got their paychecks. We were more willing to spend money. The whole purpose was economic. Anyway, now, here is another side of this story of Joanne. What made her so smart? There have been persons who have done some research and said that she really was an illegitimate daughter of Charles VI, but Charles didn't want anyone to know of her existence, so he moved her way out, far away from his palace, near the edge of his kingdom, to where nobody would recognize her as such, and that she was brought up by these peasants, but she actually was highly gifted and highly educated because she was the king's illegitimate daughter, and therefore she was a half-brother of Charles VII. That might have been one reason why that she recognized Charles VII for who he was, in spite of the fact that Charles VII dressed in lackey clothes, as I've already mentioned. Of course, there's still some things about her that just cannot be explained. Now, as to how she was able to lead an army, again, what she did for the people of France was she infused into a sense of patriotism that had not been seen in France in many, many a day, and something the French people do not tend to have. But she infused into us, like I said, a sense of patriotism. Also, she is sometimes called the first modern woman, in that she believed a woman should be able to think independently of a man, independent of her father, independent of her husband, even though Joanne never married. Well, okay, now, I want to say that there are persons who think that what the king actually did was he took a girl who was really a witch and traded her for Joanne secretly. In other words, took Joanne out of the prison and put this girl in prison in her place. And then when the English burned a woman at the stake, they burned someone who really was a witch. And as for Joanne herself, she was able to get out, live a normal life afterward, marry, have children, and go scot-free. This story is told also. And again, as to her voices, I promised you I'm not going to try to explain it. As for her visions or whatever, her ability to tell a man he was going to be dead soon and to be dead within an hour, I'm not going to try to explain that for you. It's just, that's part of the story as told by the most educated people at that time, so I'm telling it to you the way it's come down. Within 7 years after she died, the King of France, who really proved to be a very intelligent man, well, basically what he did, for 2 years he sat in his throne and inactive. Then he caught fire, you might say. He caught fire, and he would look around where the English were and pick out where's the place the most likely to win. He'd pick his fights. As he won a fight, he'd get a duke on his side, a French duke. He won another. By the way, the Burgundians were Frenchmen themselves. Well, in 7 years after Joanne died, the Duke of Burgundy joined with the King of France. Then shortly after that, the Duke of Lorraine joined. And when the King of France had the Duke of Burgundy and Duke of Lorraine on his side, the English might as well have gone home, which they finally did. The English gave up almost all their French territories. Later, well, they had one city left, and they gave that up 100 years or so later. And the English were driven out of France permanently. All right. Within, let's see, 52 years, and I'm old enough that some of my memories go back there, 52 years after Joanne died, Martin Luther was born. And shortly after Martin Luther was born, Christopher Columbus discovered America. The world was about to undergo some huge, huge changes. Shortly after Joanne died in 1453, this has been called by some the dividing point between medieval history and modern, even though your book goes to 1500 because it's a nice round number. But in 1453, the 100 Years' War ended. And the Byzantine Empire came to an end. The Turks captured Constantinople. The ruler of the Turks at this time was Mehmet II. Now, folks, this was a big cause for alarm in Europe because it has been known that the Turks planned to capture all of Europe. Well, in 1453, they got Constantinople, and next they set their sights on Vienna. In 1580, they went to Vienna, but the Europeans rose up. Now, when Mehmet II went to Constantinople, the Europeans did not rise up to help. Hardly anyone came from Europe. The Genoese did, but nobody else came from Europe to help. But when they went to Vienna, that got the Europeans alarmed, and an army from Poland came down. They defeated the Turks then. Then in 1680, folk, only about 340 years ago, less than 40 years ago, the Turks again the Muslims went to try to take Vienna. Again, the Europeans rose up, but that was the last incursion that the Turks made into, or the Muslims, you might say, made into Europe. Technology changed greatly, and all the technological advances. I had a woman in this morning's class, not this morning, but she was in this morning's class. She got on to me last Wednesday all over for saying that the Muslims have not made any technological progress in 900 years. Folks, this is still largely true. They haven't made any technological progress in 900 years, owing to two things. Number one, the Turks themselves stopped all technological progress. But number two, their science and their theology started to conflict. And they made sure that science took a back seat. The same thing happened to Europe, where science and theology started to conflict. But in Europe's case, Europe's science forged ahead in spite of the theological conflicting, which is still going on. There's a lot of conflict still between science and theology. But science marches on in spite. And among the Islamic people, science, for all practical purposes, came to a halt long about the year 1000. But after 1680, Europe had better rifles. By this time, the rifle was in widespread use in warfare. Europe had better rifles, better cannon, and all told, better maneuverability. And the Muslims were left behind. All right, now, one more story, then I will review. The church. The church had held a whole lot of powerful sway for hundreds of years. And folk, hear this from you probably have guessed by now, I myself am a church man. But the church had too much political power and too much political influence. And I called Pope Gregory the Great a church man, not a statesman. But later popes became statesmen, which they had no business being. But a lot of your popes after, during the 10, 11, 1200s, 1300s were also statesmen. And more than just churchmen. But anyway, the popes had enjoyed a lot of control until the time of Pope Boniface VIII. Pope Boniface VIII told King Philip the Fair of France what not to do. That name, Philip the Fair, keeps coming up. Philip said, I'm not going to take this anymore. And Philip sent an army, and Pope Boniface had to flee. Pope Boniface went into hiding. He escaped Philip, but he died of a broken heart shortly afterward. I mean, that's what it's believed he died of. He was not an old man. But with him, the Catholic Church lost its authority over kings. King Philip moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France. Oops. And for 70 years, the popes operated from here. Now, this has been called the Babylonian captivity because the Babylonian captivity in biblical times, and I've got to find a marker. Babylonian captivity lasted 70 years. So for 70 years, the popes ruled from Avignon, and it was understood that they were now under the control of the King of France. And again, folks, I'm saying this was not necessarily good either. The church should have been independent, and they eventually became so. But anyway, the popes ruled from Avignon for a period of 70 years. Now, I want to state, folk, I heard something on the news this morning that reminded me of somewhat of this. In our own country, we don't have the church telling our president what to do, but our courts are telling our president what to do. Now that's what's one thing if the Supreme Court tells the president he can't do something. But we're letting every little bitty rinky-dink court in the country, and what it's like if every justice of the peace could tell the president, no, you can't do this, you can't send your army here. Well, anyway, I've just heard that the Ninth Circuit Court made a decision blocking one of the president's moves, and today the Supreme Court overturned. Now, the Supreme Court constantly overturned, but the point I'm trying to make is, what right did the Ninth Circuit Court have to tell the president what he can and cannot do? You may or may not know, folks, the Constitution did not give the courts the right of judicial review. How the courts get it? They usurped it. They grabbed it. This, at least one of you has heard this before. And I had a pretty liberal student one time, and when I was talking about this very topic, say it's going to take a president who will dare stand up to court and say no. So far, we have not had a president who's been strong enough to do that.
Andrew Jackson.
What's that?
Andrew Jackson.
Now, okay, in modern time, Andrew Jackson did, thank you, you know it. Andrew Jackson said, Mr. Marshall, has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And he refused to obey the court. But since then, Franklin Roosevelt tried it, and he lost. And every president since then has been afraid to take on the courts for fearing impeachment. But it's going to take a president who will one day stand up to court and say, enough of your tyranny. You don't have the authority that you usurped. Well, anyway, like I say, the King of France stood up to the Pope and said, you don't really have the authority that you usurped, and refused to be bullied around by the Pope anymore. Well, now, what happened after 70 years was a Pope who was, the church was still appointing the popes. Now, don't get me wrong, the King of France, whatever else you can say about him, the kings of France did not pick popes. But a Pope finally decided he was going to move back to Rome after 70 years. So the Pope moved to Rome, but a bunch of people just said, no, the popes have been in Avignon all of our lives. And keep in mind, 70 years was a long time in those days for a person to live. Oh yeah, every generation has had people live to be 100. Today we have more people living to that age. But 120 years seems to be the maximum a human can live. And we have not been able to extend that maximum. We've just got more people getting closer and closer to it, but we don't know how to extend it. But anyway, a lot of persons objected, so they elected a new pope who promised to rule in Avignon. So now the church had two popes. one in Avignon and one in Rome. The two popes they excommunicated each other, and they hurled curses at each other, and they condemned each other to eternal torment. This went on for a little while, and the people of Europe decided, now wait a minute, now we really need to have just the church speaking with one united voice. So they got together and said, well, they told the church, you need to elect a pope. And, well, they did. They elected another pope, and he moved from Rome, but the problem was the other two would not retire. So now the church had 3 popes. This spoke is a big scandal, and I think my marker has gone completely dry. Anyway, the church now had 3 popes, and oh my, this was a big scandal in Europe. Well, finally, the emperor got involved, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he told one of the popes that, why don't you call for an ecumenical council, and I'll get all the nobles and royalty to promise that they will recognize only the pope that the council picks. So the church, this pope called a council, the ecumenical council. The church picked the pope, and true to their word, all of Europe's nobility, all of Europe's royalty, all of Europe's princes and the emperor accepted the pope the church picked, and the other 3 men, having no support, finally retired. Now, folks, you might know this made news as recently as 2013, when in modern times we had the pope resign. It was the first pope that resigned since these 3 popes had resigned during the Great Schism, or the Babylonian captivity, also known as the Great, and I'll see if I can get this to right. During the Great Schism, all 3 resigned. Well, the new pope felt sorry for the 3 men who had to resign, so he made all 3 of them cardinals, which meant that they might could become pope again, except there was one problem. He outlived all 3 of them. In those days, life was shorter generally than it is now, and even the pope they elected only lasted 5 years. By that time, all 3 of the others had passed on. But anyway, the Great Schism, though, did a lot to weaken the power of the church, weaken the prestige of the church, and paved the way for the Protestant Reformation that came about 100 years later.